seminar. My name is Jenny Liu. I am an assistant professor in the School of Urban Studies and Planning, and along with Professor Li-Ming Wang and Professor Figliosi, we host this Friday transportation seminar. And today we're very happy to have two of our own students presenting their research that they're doing as part of their PhD programs. So I think the first student is Patrick Singleton, who we have here. And he is a PhD student in our civil engineering program. And our second student presenter will be Ryan Dann, who is in the PhD program of Urban Studies and Planning. So a warm welcome.
I'm pleased to be here to talk about my research today. This is something I presented at TRB earlier this month. It's work that arose out of my master's thesis under my advisor, Dr. Kelly Clifton, and it's basically a conceptual framework of active travel behavior that we're calling the theory of travel decision-making. So what do we mean by travel behavior? You're probably familiar with this, but I'll go over it pretty quickly. Basically, travel behavior is the who, what, when, where, why, and how of personal transportation. So we're interested in how people get around for their daily lives. So we might be interested in things like the frequency with which they travel, the destinations they go to, the modes they choose, the routes they choose. This is particularly interesting for urban areas where there's a lot of other issues. One of the ways that we represent travel behavior in our analysis methods is by using travel demand models. So you see here the four-step process: trip generation, distribution, mode choice, and assignment, which happen to relate to these four large aspects of travel behavior. So what's active travel? Well, that's active transportation. We typically think of that as walking and biking, sometimes transit, because all of these modes provide physical activity in addition to our transportation. So policymakers and planners and engineers are getting really interested in these modes for a number of reasons. For one, they have the potential to reduce automobile use and some of the negative externalities associated with that. Things like congestion, air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change. They also have the potential to reduce governmental and consumer costs. On the one hand, if we maybe invest more in walking and biking infrastructure, we might not have to invest so much in expensive roadway improvements. On the other hand, if you can walk and bike, and you may not have to drive as much, or maybe you can reduce your automobile ownership, which saves a considerable amount of costs for the consumer. And finally, walking and biking have the potential to improve health personally through the physical activity that one gains, and socially through improvements to air quality and noise pollution, and as well as increased accessibility. So why are we interested in active transportation and active travel behavior? Well, people are getting more interested in evaluating a wider range of types of interventions. So we are getting a better sense of how to predict the influence on walking and biking of engineering projects, things like the Green Lane project, evaluating protected bike lanes, that sort of thing. We do also have a lot of information about how the built environment might affect our travel choices around walking and biking. What we might not be able to better capture, however, is the impact of an educational program like the cycling education that's universal for children in some parts of Northern Europe, or encouragement programs like here in Portland, Sunday Parkways, or in other cities, ciclovías, for example. And finally, enforcement actions. So the tools that we use to predict the impacts on our travel behavior, especially for active modes, can accommodate all of these types of interventions. These planning tools, as I mentioned before, typically are travel demand models. And they not only can't predict some of these influences, the interventions on active travel, they also do a relatively poor job of representing walking and biking in the models themselves. So we did a recent study that looked at the large metropolitan planning organizations in the country. These are the organizations that are responsible for long-range transportation planning and funneling the federal funds to do metropolitan transportation planning. We looked at their models, and we found that only about 2/3 actually included non-motorized modes in their model. And of those, only about half distinguished between walking and biking, even though we know that the influences on the two modes are very different, and the scales at which they operate are also different. So stepping back a little bit, We also have a desire to know more about the influences on our travel behavior, especially for walking and biking. And this is part of the reason why the models aren't up to speed quite yet. We know there are a whole bunch of different influences, things like our sociodemographics, things like gender or income, household interactions, having to other responsibilities, the built environment. Time and cost are certainly major factors, also attitudes. What we don't have is a good comprehensive sense of how all of these influences act together to influence our choices of walking and biking. And this is really the focus of our research. So to summarize the motivation for this study, we wanted to improve our knowledge of travel behavior and our understanding of the influences on active transportation so as to influence the development of better planning tools that we can use to evaluate a wider range of types of transportation projects, policies, and programs. And hopefully that will result in more efficient and more socially desirable transportation outcomes. And again, today I'm just going to talk about this first part of our work. So to do this, we first reviewed a number of studies, both theoretical and empirical literatures from a wide range of fields, not only engineering and planning, but economics, psychology, geography. All of these had something to say about active travel behavior. And so we used these literatures and we synthesized them into our conceptual framework. And this is what I'm going to be talking to you about most of the time. I'll go through each step one by one so we get a better sense of our hypothesis here. But before we do that, I just want to note that this framework, we're intending it to apply only to short-term travel decisions, day-to-day things. We're not concerned with longer-term decisions like your choice to own vehicles or your choices of residential or work locations. Also, although we're focusing on walking and biking here, we acknowledge that this framework's broader and could apply to all modes and decisions beyond mode choice. But I think it helps if we think about mode choice when we're walking through the framework here. All right, so before we even talk about travel, we need to talk about activities. These are things like working, shopping, going to school. Let's take, for example, you decide you want to go out to eat. So the activity decision precedes the travel decision. This is what we mean by travel as a derived demand. It's derived from the demand for activities and conducting in activities that are spatially separated. So this is really the initiator of this travel decision-making process. Next, and this is a key point, this is what we're calling the hierarchy of travel needs. You could think about this as the kind of factors that you might consider or the attributes of the alternatives you might consider. So let's take our eating out example. You have to pick a destination and a mode to get there. These are the things you might consider when making those decisions. Our hierarchy borrows from some theories about human motivation. So the factors that influence our needs to protect ourselves, to provide shelter, and to provide for the safety of ourselves and our offspring. It's also related to some recent active transportation theories about walking and biking from Alfonso and Schneider. So the first need we're hypothesizing is the need for feasibility. The mode that we choose must be feasible based on our individual and household constraints. These are things like our own mobility, our skill. We can't choose to ride a bicycle if we don't know how to bicycle. Mode availability. Also things like our personal schedules, what other activities we've decided to conduct during the day, other responsibilities. Do we have to escort children to school, that sort of thing. There's evidence to suggest that some of these barriers like obesity and time constraints have been found to be barriers to further active transportation. Next is we're calling accessibility. This you could think about as the feasibility of the built environment. So let's take our eating out example again. It doesn't help if the restaurant is only a quarter mile from your house if it takes you 3/4 of a mile to walk there based on the circuitous street network. So there are a number of different influential things about the built environment. And there's quite an extensive literature on this subject. I won't go into that today. But we do see correlations between greater residential density and land use diversity and walking. Next, we posit that people choose a mode or destination or a travel choice, a travel alternative that provides them a basic level of traffic safety, so that's from fear of collisions and injuries from that, as well as personal security, fear from crime. We think these are at least theoretically distinguishable. Although there's a little limited evidence and somewhat inconclusive results in empirical literatures about this, we think that might have to do with, as I'll come back to later, the hypothesis that it's our perceptions of safety and security that matter more than some objective measures of these factors that we as analysts could observe. We do, however, see that some evidence suggests that safety and security concerns do play a role in our bicycling decisions, and especially for women. Next is cost. We're using this in a broad sense to represent some of the disutilities of travel, things like time and cost, obviously, but also physical exertion, which is important for walking and biking. Mental effort, maybe for wayfinding in an unfamiliar setting. Also unreliability, that's especially important for other modes as well. So, for example, we see that in walk and bicycle route choice models, distance is, of course, a significant impact on which route we choose, and grade has also been found to be important as a proxy for the physical exertion that one must do. All right, and finally, pleasure. This is what we're calling the positive utility of travel, all the things that you might like about travel. So maybe you choose to bike to the restaurant because you enjoy the benefits, you get the benefits of exercise, or maybe because you like to sightsee, you like to see your neighbors, you like to be outdoors, or maybe you just like bicycling, like you like the sense of motion. And again, these things aren't really in our models at all. There's some evidence, including some research here at PSU, that suggests that people who walk and bike to work and to school enjoy their commutes more and have a higher overall sense of well-being. So that's the hierarchy of travel needs. I'll just briefly go over where factors like our travel characteristics and sociodemographics influence this framework. We know that a number of personal characteristics, things like age, gender, race, and income, do have a role in our travel behavior. However, we think that they have an indirect role, not a direct role. And that indirect role is sometimes called moderation or taste variation, but basically it means that our personal characteristics might explain why some of us have different perceptions of these attributes. So maybe someone with a higher income is less sensitive to cost than someone with a lower income, for example. We also see evidence that the influence between, the relationship between accessibility and walking differs by age. So before we make a decision, our framework suggests that the factors that we're considering in that hierarchy of needs flow through what we're calling the perception lens before one actually makes a decision. This is where we're including a lot of the psychological factors and psychosocial aspects, things like our norms, our values, our attitudes, relating to some psychological theories like the theory of play and behavior. And what's important here is that, again, it's not our objective measures of safety and security that matters. They're subjective measures, so our perceptions of safety and security. There's some evidence to suggest that the perceived built environment is more strongly related to our bicycling behavior than the measured built environment. And we see that attitudes and social norms do impact travel mode choices. All right, finally, we come to making a decision. Economists like to talk about how we consider all of the factors involved in the choice and all of the attributes of all of those alternatives, considering, and you pick the very best one, ranking everything else. Well, sometimes we don't do that. Sometimes we just pick the fastest one, or the cheapest one, or the safest one, or the most enjoyable mode. So our framework suggests that different decision rules like that could be applied by different people in different circumstances. Finally, once someone makes a choice, they might result in an outcome, and it could be on one of these dimensions, again, the frequency, route, mode, destination. It could also be on multiple dimensions. This could be applied sequentially, so you pick the restaurant and then you pick the mode to go there, or it could be simultaneously. Maybe you pick the restaurant and the mode at the same time, or maybe you flip it. Maybe you pick the mode you want to walk, and then you pick the restaurant based on that. Finally, one last component is a feedback mechanism. So from your travel choices, there's influence from past travel choices as well. So if you make repeated similar travel decisions, maybe that leads to the formation of habits, which could provide some inertia into our decision-making process, perhaps bypassing a consideration of other alternatives or different factors. On the other hand, maybe you're faced with a new choice, or you decide, hey, I haven't biked before, maybe I will bike. Well, that might, we're calling it exploration, and that might provide new information to adjust your perceptions of aspects of that trip. So maybe you find that it's not as hard, or you maybe like it more than you thought. So that might change your perceptions, which then could change your future travel decisions. So this is the whole conceptual framework altogether. I don't have time to explain it here, but we have evaluated those travel demand models with respect to our framework, noting where they do a great job, where they may not represent some of these aspects quite as well. And we've noted some future research needs and data needs as well to hopefully, if these influences are important and in fact work in this hypothesized manner, what we might need to start to incorporate them into our planning tools. So again, this is the motivation for our study. We looked at how to improve our at least basic understanding of some of these influences on travel behavior, especially for active modes. And in the future, we're going to work to operationalize some of these relationships into our planning tools like travel demand models. So thank you for your time. I want to acknowledge some generous funders, my co-author, Kelly Clifton. And if you're interested, you can find more information. This is a link to my thesis and a QR code right there as well. I'll be happy to take some questions. Yeah.
Has there been any research done into the enforcement of restricted lanes, bike lanes, or BRT lanes, or even streetcar lanes? And is there any evidence that maybe if they're more visually distinctive, that might influence perception?
It's a good question. I'm not familiar with that literature, but I can see how that might be a result of or a finding of one of those studies. I'm not exactly sure, though. Yeah.
So I know that you mentioned that the work really concentrates on short-term decisions, but how do long-term decisions sort of play into that model?
So one possibility might be that, let's say you're thinking about where to live or where to choose to live. Maybe you consider some super simplified version of this. If you're imagining maybe your travel to school here based on where the options you may have to where to choose to live, you might consider a simplified version of this where, oh, well, I think I might ride my bike or I might take the bus, and then I consider all these things. So that might be one way that this could fit into longer-term choices like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I can see the hierarchy of travel needs. So how have you established it, like what goes up and what stays down?
That's a really good question. It's definitely not set in stone by any means. Some of the other research and theoretical work that we've observed has put them into similar arrangement, especially looking at the pleasure cost and the influence of safety and security there. But definitely for some people or some situations, some of these factors could be flipped. It might depend, definitely. Any questions back there? Oh, there.
How does the use of like apps for like planning your trip factor into that?
That's a great question. So one thing that I've thought is that the ability to search for unfamiliar destinations or routes. Really, one aspect could be that it brings our perceptions more in line with on-the-ground facts. So maybe we have a better sense of the actual distances involved, the actual time that it might take. So that might align our perceptions a little bit closer. It could also provide new information to our travel decision process that we didn't know before. So I think that those are two main areas that it could influence travel behavior.
So, sometimes in the study of epistemology of science, like you have to think about theories and how you can prove a theory when you formulate it. So, how do you think about how would you go about proving or disproving this framework?
That's a good question. We've tried to structure it so that, at least in the broad form, that some of these could be reduced to specific statistical tests. So our use of mediation, for example, here, if we had observed measures of safety or cost, and we could ask people their perceptions of those measures and observe their travel behavior, we could test whether their perceptions actually mediate and act indirectly to their actual travel choices. Another way we've thought about it is to use the hierarchy of travel needs to define a utility equation for indiscrete choice modeling. So that could be one way we would also tackle that.
So I can see how those things that you just brought up would be compelling, sort of like in an academic sense.
Yeah.
But sort of from a practitioner's perspective, I'm curious about how you would get something like this adopted into sort of those planning tools, and maybe if your argument would be sort of the same or if it would be a little bit different.
Yeah. One way that we've thought about addressing the interest from that community and the interest for those kinds of efforts is to use the framework as a way to explain what the impacts of certain interventions might be. So if we were to install more protected bikeways, that should hopefully reduce the cost, maybe making more direct routes, maybe improve our perceptions of safety that we might have, and then maybe make bicycling more attractive. So it might be a way to trace the paths of how those interventions might influence our behavior.
You mentioned encouragement programs, and I'm just wondering, for cities that have had success for getting people to explore different modes, if there's any common themes, encouragement programs that work well?
I wouldn't say I'm an expert in this, but I would say a couple things that I have noticed is information and making it fun are two important aspects. Things like the work that the City of Portland does, their Smart Trips programs, and also combined with aspects like Pedalpalooza, for example, have been really helpful. All right. Anything else? Okay. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Ryan. I'm a PhD student in urban studies. I'm going to present my research that I did at TRB on the factors associated with the bicycle commute use of newcomers to major cities. But before we get started here, since I have a great captive audience, I'd like to do a little field study, if you don't mind. So by a show of hands, who here often uses a bicycle as a means of transportation? Okay. We are in Portland at a college campus. Makes some sense. There's a lot of people here. But keep your hands up if you use a bicycle as a means of transportation. Really high. But also, only keep your hand up if you consider yourself a native of Portland. Okay, great. That somewhat worked out. So it works out better in some situations. But this is showing that newcomers have a potential to make a large percentage of a city's bicycle population. And that's what I'm talking about today, newcomers and their impact on cities and how newcomers, what influences newcomers to use bikes upon moving to cities. So a little outline of my presentation today. I'm going to start with introducing the topic of newcomers to cities and what factors lead to their bicycle use. And then talk about why newcomers might matter to cities. And then go into my research that I did at TRB, what I presented there on the factors associated with newcomers' bike use, talk about the methodology I used, as well as the results of my statistical analysis, and then go on to the conclusions and limitations of my study. So to start off, I usually have a slide about why bikes matter. In Portland, this is not as important because everybody should know that in Portland, but bikes matter to cities. They're becoming more important to cities. A lot of cities are trying to increase their bicycle use. Bicycle commuting, as a result, has increased dramatically since the year 2000, more so than any other mode. And some cities are definitely seeing a larger increase in bicycle use than others. Portland being one of these cities has definitely led the nation in the amount of bicycle commuting since the year 2000. A lot of other cities are doing pretty good, just definitely not as well as Portland. So I moved to Portland during the time period of my study in the late 2000s. And as a newcomer to Portland, I saw a lot of other newcomers using bikes, and kind of I was feeling driving the growth in bicycle use. So it got me thinking, well, are newcomers could newcomers be a reason why we've seen such dramatic growth in bicycle use in Portland? So digging around in the census data, I found that, yeah, the newcomers do represent a large portion of the bicycle population. Roughly 9 to 15% of the entire bicycle population was made up of people who had not even lived in Portland 1 year prior to taking the survey. And then looking at the entire newcomer population as a whole, around 8 to 16% of just newcomers to Portland use a bike, compared to roughly 6% of the population as a whole. So you might be thinking, well, hold on, Ryan. Newcomers and bikers, they seem to be very similar. They have some similar characteristics. They're young, they're probably college educated, they're single, very similar to bicyclists in Portland as well. And then, so yes, that is very true, but then controlling for other demographics as well as those, such as education, age, sex, we still find that there's a newcomer effect, that there's a 50% greater likelihood of a newcomer using a bike than their native counterpart. So then you're saying, well, hold on, this is great, this isn't working in Portland. There's definitely a newcomer effect in Portland, but is this something we also see across the country? Could other cities see the same kind of newcomer effect? And so I expanded this research outside of Portland and looked at the top 70 largest cities in terms of population across the United States, and saw that there still is a newcomer effect. Newcomers are riding at higher levels than their pre-existing native counterpart, and newcomers are making up a large percentage of the total bicycle population in these cities as well. So there's definitely a newcomer effect that is going on in terms of bicycle use. And then looking at these are the top cities in terms of bicycle use in the United States, top major cities. And we see that some cities are definitely have a larger newcomer base of bike riders than other cities. But I think the major takeaway from this chart is showing that almost every one of these cities has a larger percentage of newcomers who use bikes than their native counterparts. And so this isn't a phenomenon that's kind of isolated in the research field. A lot of politicians are kind of noticing that their levels of bicycle growth could be influenced by attracting new people to their cities. Here's a couple quotes from two major mayors from major cities, showing that they are indeed trying to attract or steal bicyclists from other cities. And then we see kind of the counter argument of, well, we don't want our bicyclists here to be newcomers in other cities. We want to do what we can to retain our established bicycle use in our city. So this brings us to the research that I presented at TRB, showing what factors that cities have that are influencing newcomers to use bikes. And the purpose of doing this was just to see what cities can do or what cities are doing to get this population to use bikes, or to attract a certain type of population into your city who's already known to use bikes. And then Then is more of the urban policy or the social issues of what kind of population are you making if you're attracting these types of residents who are prone to use bikes, and what are you making your city turn into or look like in terms of its population. So the data set that I used for this analysis was primarily from the American Community Survey. It's an annual survey put out by the census. It's a sample. And then I used more of the micro data set within this study to capture both migration patterns, newcomer status, and bicycle use. So I looked at the top 70 largest cities in terms of population, and I controlled for bicycle infrastructure using a data set put out by the Alliance of Biking and Walking, a pretty respected data set that is comparable across cities in terms of the amount of bicycle infrastructure for each city. And so before we go too much further, we want to establish what I mean by bicycle user and newcomer. A bicycle user is, in this study, someone who's commuted by bike, who's indicated that their primary method of transportation before they were surveyed is a bicycle. And a newcomer in my study is someone who's moved from one metropolitan region to a brand new metropolitan region inside of a city. From a metropolitan region to a city of two different metropolitan regions. So, for example, someone moving from Vancouver, Washington to Portland, Oregon would not be a newcomer, same metropolitan region, but somebody moving from Eugene, Oregon to Portland, Oregon would be a newcomer, as those are two different metropolitan regions. And then is somebody who's moved within the past year. So these are pretty recent newcomers. So looking at the descriptive results of my analysis, or just of the census kind of overall look of the sample, we see that newcomers who use bikes are generally a little younger than a typical newcomer, more likely to be male, white, single, never married, have a college education, and a little bit wealthier. And so this shows where newcomer cyclists are likely to move to and across the United States. We see that they have a preference for Pacific states, California, Washington, and Oregon. We live in Oregon, so it makes sense. It's a wonderful place. But it's definitely much more likely for a newcomer cyclist to move to these Pacific states than a typical newcomer, although that's still kind of the leading direction for newcomers in general. And looking at what type of city that a newcomer prefers in terms of bicycle infrastructure. So I've taken bicycle infrastructure and codified it across the cities and put it in the quartiles, going from low to very high. And a typical newcomer to these cities doesn't seem to really have a preference for the amount of bicycle infrastructure that these cities have. It makes sense. If they're not going to use a bike, why would they care about the bicycle infrastructure? But a typical newcomer who uses a bike definitely has a preference for the amount of infrastructure that is apparent in the cities that they're moving to, definitely showing a preference for high and very high levels of bicycle infrastructure. And so this chart shows the amount of pre-existing bicycle use that is in these cities before the newcomer influences that level of bicycle infrastructure, bicycle use. So this shows that a typical newcomer is almost showing a preference for cities that have low or medium levels of existing bicycle use. And a typical newcomer bicyclist has it opposite, where they prefer cities with high or very high levels of existing bicycle use. So going on to my regression models, my logistic regression models. This is the first model that I did, just having demographics in my model showing, this shows the odds ratio of the regression model. We don't need to go into exactly what this means, but just know that an odds ratio of 1 shows really no predictive power in these factors. So starting off, or I won't go into each one, but so this shows that males counter to females have about a 2.5 greater odds of using a bicycle upon moving. And then as it approaches 1, it shows the less predictive power. And then my second model, I included the built environment, the amount of bicycle infrastructure in these cities. And we see that for every increase in the level of bicycle infrastructure, going from low to medium, medium to high, high to very high, we see a 50% greater odds of a newcomer using a bicycle. That's my second model, controlling for the demographics that are already in the first model. Throwing in my proxy for bicycle culture, which is the pre-existing levels of bicycle use. We see that for every increase in the level of existing bicycle use, that a newcomer has a doubling the odds of them using a bicycle upon moving. And then I think the really important part of this model is what happens to the built environment, the amount of bicycle infrastructure. That predictive power goes almost down to 1, which is very little predictive power in terms of determining whether a newcomer will start using a bicycle or use a bicycle when they moved. And then going deeper into this, we see separate out those different levels of pre-existing bicycle use. We have on the far extreme end, compared to low levels of existing bicycle use, very high level of existing bicycle use, we see about 7 times the odds of a newcomer using a bike upon moving, holding everything else constant. So what have we learned here, I guess? We've seen that newcomers in general are likely to be male, white, college-educated, and single. Here's a picture of me fitting all 4 of those categories at the time, biking in Portland. And we've also seen that bicycle infrastructure, it doesn't have as large of an impact once we've included or accounted for existing levels of bicycle use. And but one caveat, the existing levels of bicycle infrastructure does have an impact if the levels of existing bicycle use is very low. And then, once again, the existing levels of bicycle use is overall one of the best determinants of whether a newcomer will use a bicycle upon moving. Okay, so why could this be? Why would a newcomer likely use a bike if there's high levels of bicycle use? Well, there's definitely that safety in numbers idea that's been out there. It's easier to bike in a situation where you see other people biking around. You know the safety and you know which routes to go. And there's the other, there's a package that comes with bicycle use, whether it's the bicycle culture around with more bike amenities, bike-related businesses and repair shops, or just the lifestyle amenities that are packaged with a bicycle culture, green lifestyle, sustainable living, things like that. And then why wouldn't bicycle infrastructure be as effective? Well, we're in Portland. We definitely know the issues that we deal with bicycle infrastructure, where there's definitely a lag that happens. It takes a while for a demand for certain areas to actually get that infrastructure that is necessary for safe and efficient bike riding in areas. And not all bicycle infrastructure is created equal. We also know this in Portland. A bike lane on Powell is probably not going to be as effective as a bike lane on Belmont, Hawthorne, or elsewhere. And we also know the last part in Portland as well, bicycle infrastructure is not state-of-the-art. We don't have a lot of the amenities and infrastructure that is available to bicycle riders in other parts of the world, such as Western Europe. So going on to the limitations of my study, we see that, once again, I was using commute data to represent bicycle use, and that only represents a very small portion of the overall trips that a household will make, 22%. And there's the idea of when a newcomer, what establishes a newcomer? I had lived in Portland 5 to 6 years. I still thought of myself as a newcomer, but in this data set, I would not be a newcomer. And then we don't really have an idea of causation or the causality that's in this model, whether cities are acting as magnets, attracting or stealing bicyclists from other cities, or if they're acting as catalysts, kind of releasing the inner bicyclist that you never know was in you until you moved to that city and said, hey, I can start biking here. And lastly, limitations within the data set as a whole. The ACS is a sample, so within that there's reliability issues and the issue of actually slicing and dicing the data too finely. Looking at migration patterns and bike use in specific neighborhoods is not possible, as the sample gets really too small and the reliability kind of goes out the window there. And then there's and to improve the sample size and the reliability, I need to aggregate over 5 years, so the data really isn't as fresh as I would like it. My data set goes from 2007 to 2011, so you can see that the issue of bicycling, or the bicycle use between 2007 and 11, might be a little bit different. And then, once again, my data set, using PUMS, which is a micro data set within the American Community Survey, you mask a lot of variation that is held within a city. We can't determine whether migrants are moving, or newcomers are going to inner southeast Portland, or if they're going to the Portland West Hills or East Portland within. So it's just looking at the city as a whole. And that will conclude my study. So thank you. Contact information, and if you want, you can follow me on Twitter. Any questions? Yes?
What effect does climate or weather play into it?
Yeah, that's something that often comes up. It's a mixed bag in terms of research. I did not include that in my sample, in my study. In general, you usually see a stronger negative correlation with extreme hot weather. Cold weather, you see a lot of cycling in Minneapolis, Madison, New York City even, places that you wouldn't expect a lot of cycling to happen there, but you do. Seattle with rain, Portland with rain. So weather is kind of a tricky one when it comes to factoring that in models. Yes?
Yeah, I was also wondering about that. I noticed that newcomer bike use had a definite northern tilt in the South Atlantic and the Southwest and the South Central. There was all lower use. Is that a race thing? Is that an age thing with boomers going down to retire from Florida? So I've seen.
Yeah, and that could definitely be a demographics driving that situation. There is definitely more retirement-headed individuals going southern migration. But yeah, there's definitely, and there's the whole migration trend of the United States is usually further south and further west. So you definitely see that kind of influences numbers here as well. But in general, you do see a stronger prevalence in biking in the northern and kind of western areas. And that could just be a cultural thing of a lot of different factors that could be going into that. Yes?
Are there any cities that have results that surprise you in your analysis, like any outliers or?
Yeah, to go back to that, I would say Austin, actually. I mean, Austin's kind of an outlier, and Austin is not in the west or in the north, and it has a large percentage of newcomers who use bikes, and that could be a cultural thing. I mean, a lot of people would say that Austin's very similar in culture, not climate, that Portland is. Same kind of sustainable lifestyles and college campus things going on there. But yeah, that's one of the findings that surprised me.
Were you seeing in the data from the other cities that don't have such a large population of kind of homogeneous male, white, educated folks? Were you seeing like an inverse anywhere in places that do have more just actual diversity within the city limits?
Yeah, so Portland, in general, like the bicycle scene is probably definitely skewed towards those factors. But people who are coming to Portland are pretty typical, are closer to the population as a whole. I wouldn't say there's any. Looking at the migration patterns, it's tricky to classify some cities as like those are the heavily dominant male white cities, and I don't know. That's a good question. Anything else? Yes.
So when you say that people moved within a year, that's really interstate, right?
That is
metropolitan.
Metropolitan,
right?
yes.
But it's not like just. Did you look at all at like the influence of just moving from one place to another?
Within your own city?
Changing modes towards.
Do you mean apart from the metropolitan, like within a city or within? Yeah, that's. So I separated those. I made it to distinguish between intra-metropolitan moves and between metropolitan moves. I figured that I also was kind of fascinated with the idea of kind of a blind move. Like you don't know exactly what you're getting into. If going from Minneapolis to Portland, you might not know exactly what Portland has to offer you. But if you're going from Beaverton to Portland, you'd probably have a pretty good idea of what Portland's going to be like and what your day-to-day activity and travel will be like. So it also kind of gets between the competition that metropolitan regions have with each other. Definitely Seattle and Portland and San Francisco are all going to be kind of fighting for the same kind of newcomer. And so getting kind of within that, I think it's easier to kind of have applications that are more practical that can go out to practitioners who are working for cities and trying to influence their levels of bicycle use. But yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, thanks. Anything else? All right, great, thank you.
Thank you.